Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Simon Mills. I'm a Senior Associate at the Zien Group, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's FS Club webinar, where we're going to be discussing financing for steel sector decarbonisation and the significance of standards. Now, I'm joined by Annie Heaton, who's the CEO of ResponsibleSteel, a not-for-profit global multi-stakeholder standards and certification organisation, which is a driving force in the socially and environmentally responsible production of net zero steel. Now, as always, the agenda for this webinar is very simple. Following my introduction, our speaker is going to make their presentation, and then we're going to move on to the Q&A session. Now, I am afraid that you're all muted, but you are able to submit your questions through the chat tool, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. Please do chip in at any point of the proceedings. I'm going to be collating your questions and I will put them to Annie at the end. Now, as with all of our FS Club webinars, we're going to be recording this session and you'll be able to access the slides and presentation at a later date. But before we move on, I really must thank the FS Club members who've opened up our webinar series to the public. With their help, since March of 2020, we've held nearly 700 of these events on topics as diverse as money laundering, the metaverse, and high salinity agriculture. The FS Club is the premier global executive knowledge network for technology and finance, where members and their guests can meet over a glass of wine to debate key issues which impact on financial services, technology, and society. It's very much like a 21st century version of the city's 17th century coffee houses. Now, before we start, we have got a quick poll question, and we're going to leave it up for a couple of seconds before we crack on. Right, hopefully you've all responded. And without further ado, I would like to introduce today's speaker. Annie, can you tell us about steel sector decarbonisation?
Thank you, Simon. Thank you very much. Right. Good morning, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes on this very challenging topic. It's a topic which every economy of the world is struggling with, to work out how to do what needs to be done in the most efficient and effective way, which is also equitable across the world. Steel is, as you know, a globally traded commodity. And so we can't look at any country in isolation, and that's why ResponsibleSteel actually was developed to take a global approach to the issue of standards on ESG in the steel industry. Today's talk is about steel decarbonisation in particular, but I will reference other aspects of ESG because they're all incredibly relevant to the industry. So without further ado, if I can show my screen, I believe I am doing that. Can you all see my screen? Simon, can you just confirm for me? I can't hear you, Simon, so I'm assuming
I've muted myself. That's perfect.
Good.
There is a couple of second delay when you forward your slides.
Okay, fine, thanks. So I think you all know that steel has a big chunk of the global carbon footprint, about 7% if you look at just direct emissions, more if you look at the whole value chain. So with that, a lot of focus is on steel, also chemicals, cement, and other heavy industries. And these have been dubbed the hard to abate sectors. I don't think it's helpful to talk about being hard to abate because we have to rise to this challenge and we have to abate. So we need to work out how to turn the steel sector from a hard to abate sector into a fast to abate sector. The emissions of steel at the moment are around the 3 billion ton mark. If with a business as usual scenario, we can see that increasing by 25% by 2050. And that's because the steel demand globally, currently around 2 billion tons, will increase to 2.5 by 2050. Why? Because steel is the backbone of the economy, and as economies grow and mature, they need infrastructure, and they need there are other aspects of quality lifestyles like transport systems that need to be furnished with materials like steel. The challenge is enormous. We need an 84% reduction by 2050. So we're talking about a full-scale industrial transformation. The price tag on that is around $6 billion, and that includes not just the change of the assets at steel-making plants, but also the infrastructure that's needed upstream to create the energy infrastructure that's needed. And probably around 2/3 of that $6 billion is going to be in the upstream energy element. We're going to see enormous changes. We're going to in the value chain. We're going to be seeing changes not only in the way steel is made, but also in the way iron is made. And that means we're also going to see changes in where iron ore comes from. We're also going to see an increase in scrap use, and that's going to be a very important lever for decarbonisation. But in general, today, 70% of the steel that's made is what we call primary steel. It's made from iron ore. By 2050, that'll probably be around 50%, because we will have more scrap by 2050. But the scrap that's available today is a function of what was produced yesterday. So there's a limit to the amount of scrap that's available. Otherwise, we could just make all steel from recycled material, but we can't. So we have to focus on the biggest challenge of all, which is decarbonising primary steel making. And a lot of scenarios have been built as to how fast this needs to be done, how much carbon we can be allowed before 2050 to keep within a 1.5 degree world. And to achieve a 1.5 degree pathway, really with a 50% probability of keeping within 1.5 degrees by the end of the century, that 84% reduction stands. And actually by 2030, we need to be getting a move on. We need to be investing in new steel assets to the tune of 170 million tons of capacity by 2030. Today, there's possibly 20-30 million tons of actual planned steel plants that will reach near zero production of steel by 2030. So the challenge is really quite enormous. And we're not only looking at how countries need steel to develop, but we're also looking at how actually the whole transition to net zero will need steel. So on the one hand, we've got the graphic on the left just shows you a growing economy, how much steel is needed. And what tends to happen is an economy will increase the amount of steel it's got in stock by increasing its consumption each year until it reaches a stable amount. At the moment, that seems to be about 10 tons per ton per capita of the population. But actually, while you're growing, you just look at the scale of China's steel consumption per capita. Europe and the US are more moderate, around 300 kilos. India, very small, but set to grow, set to explode in terms of its steel consumption. So that's where the growing steel demand is coming from. It's coming from developing countries, and it's also coming from the growth of renewable energy. So the growth of renewable energy, hydrogen infrastructure, as well as all the other infrastructure that a country needs to develop. So we're going to see growth across the world in the steel industry. And just take a look at this. Europe is likely to plateau in its steel consumption. If you just look at the overall shape of these graphs, this is steel consumption, steel demand, if you like, per annum over the next 30 years. Europe is likely to flatten off. North America will continue to grow to some extent, not least because it has a huge potential for renewable energy. A country like India is likely to be doubling its steel making capacity in the next 10 years. and the growth to 2050 is evident there. So not only have we got to focus on primary steelmaking and decarbonising that, but we have to focus on ensuring that the developing world decarbonises, and that is a huge challenge. What we need to do is ensure that near zero steel economically becomes more favourable than high emission steel, so that it's cheaper to produce near zero steel than high emission steel. That's going to take some time, and that's going to take some transformation of the economy. It's going to take huge amounts of finance. I've talked about the $6 billion, and that'll be largely in debt and bond financing, but also there's a role for shareholders in driving the right decisions, the right long-term strategy in the companies they invest in. It's going to take demand signals to really ensure that steel companies know that they won't have to shoulder the whole cost of this, that there will be some premiums in the market, at least for the first movers, to get ahead, bring near zero steel to market, and get that competitive edge. And it's going to need policy support. There's no way the markets can do this alone. The cost of near zero steel is so much more than the cost of steel today, and steel is a fairly low margin business, and therefore policy has to structurally change and also support in terms of financial incentives. Now, if you're creating policy, or if you're making financial decisions, investment decisions, and you want to see progress and performance, and if you are arranging to offtake 5 million tons of steel over the next 20 years, you want to know how that steel is defined and how the carbon footprint of that steel is defined. So it's absolutely imperative that all of these levers are underpinned by a common measurement standard and a common definition of near zero steel. And that is what ResponsibleSteel provides. Now, as I said, I'm focusing on decarbonisation today, but actually ResponsibleSteel is much broader than that. ResponsibleSteel was established as the world's first international standard for responsibly sourced and produced steel. So we are looking at ESG across the board in the production of steel and also upstream in the mining sector in particular. Sorry, oops, there we are. Sorry, I'm getting, there we are, I'll do that. Right. Trying to get this out of my screen. There we are. So today we have 143 members. This slide is 2 weeks old. We now have 150 members across the steel value chain. That, in terms of steelmakers, that represents 15% of the global industry. When you consider China is half of the global industry, you can pretty much double that figure to see how much of the ex-China steel market we have in membership. We've produced an international standard for responsibly sourced and produced steel, and really importantly, a very robust independent assurance program, so that when a site is certified against the ResponsibleSteel standard, it's audited independently, and the certification decision is also made independently. We have an independent assurance panel that makes these decisions, so that the site can then tell its customers and its investors that it has ResponsibleSteel certification. Now, that doesn't mean that there's absolutely nothing bad going on. There's no risks in the business of the site, but it means that that site is managing it well. The ResponsibleSteel as an organisation is very proud to be made up of a large range of stakeholders. It's not only steel makers, it's also steel buyers. It's also raw material suppliers. Not only that, we have civil society as a very core part of our organisation to ensure our credibility. The unique thing about ResponsibleSteel is we have business sitting down with NGOs talking about what good looks like, how to get there, and building a framework and a step ladder to enable that change to happen, that is pragmatic but also ambitious. So we cover a range of different interests within our organisation. And as Simon said in his introduction, our strategic mission is to be a driving force in the socially and environmentally responsible production of net zero steel globally. And that globally, I keep stressing, and we'll come to that later. We cover 13 different principles of ESG, everything from health and safety to biodiversity, from water stewardship to human rights, and of course climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. If you're living next to a steel plant, carbon is not your issue. It's going to be more the health and safety of the workforce. You probably have a family member that's working at the steel plant. It's going to be around noise and emissions in air quality. And it's going to be around the kind of level of information that you have from the steel plant, how much you understand about actually what's going on. If you work for a steel plant, obviously the conditions are incredibly important, your priority. If you're working in the supply chain, the human rights are going to be a key issue. So we cover the whole gambit. And when we go to audit a steel plant, our auditors, and I say our auditors, they're actually our approved auditors. They don't work for ResponsibleSteel, they're independent. But they have to go and interview relevant stakeholders of the plant. So that might be community members, it will certainly be workers, it will certainly be contractors. So the kind of risks that you see around large, heavy industry are being assessed not only through the lens of management, not only through the lens of what the auditor sees in terms of evidence, but also through the lens of stakeholder engagement. And that makes this kind of audit absolutely unique. And a lot of auditors say to us, this is so different to an ISO audit because you have the stakeholder element. And the heads of steel plants tell us they find this valuable because it kind of triangulates what their management are telling them with what the stakeholders are telling them. They need to be able to know what their stakeholders are telling them in order to manage their asset well and minimize their risks. Okay, so responsible steel certification comes in a few different forms. We have our core certification, which is those 13 principles of ESG. And then once you've achieved that core certification, your site can progress to level 1, 2, 3, or 4 certification. That will, at level 1, that will comprise an assessment of your decarbonisation process and of your responsible sourcing. As you can imagine, as you go up the levels, the requirements get more and more exacting. And as you reach level 4 of decarbonisation progress, that means your site has reached near zero, which is approximately a 90% reduction in your steel emissions from today. Nobody has achieved that as of yet. Our standard has been out in a pilot phase over the last year, and we expect the first certifications to be coming through towards the end of this year. I mentioned our assurance program. This for us, this for me really is our most sort of prized possession. We have a system of a network of certification bodies which have to apply to us to be approved. The auditors have to be trained by us in our standard. They have to pass an exam. So you can't just have anybody audit these steel plants. You can't have any steel plant making a claim about their alignment with responsible steel. They've got to go through a very rigorous process, and that makes their claims credible when it comes to market. And as I say, towards the end of this year, we expect the first steel certification to come through. And that means that the actual steel leaving the mill will be able to have a label on it saying this is achieved level 1 or level 2 certification of the progress levels I mentioned earlier. And it will have a tag which will enable anybody to look at the embodied carbon of that steel in a way that is globally comparable across the world, so that any ton of steel or any coil of steel leaving a steel bank can be compared on a like-for-like basis in terms of embodied carbon of steel and the degree to which it's progressed and matured its responsible sourcing. Today, we have 58 certified against our core standard, and that represents around 108 million tons of steel. And so we've been running this certification program for only a couple of years. We got slowed down by COVID, as you can imagine, but already we've got 5% of the global industry coming under our core certification program. And we've got a huge pipeline which is really rapidly growing across the world, with audits lined up in India, in South Africa, South America, Canada, and so on. Now, I've laid out the challenge to you. I would really like to hear your thoughts on actually how we use a standard like ResponsibleSteel and all the other levers I've mentioned to drive decarbonisation of a sector which needs to move from hard to abate to fast to abate. So who do you think is likely to have the biggest influence on the pace of change? Who can actually move the needle and drive the change most quickly? Really interested to see your results. Leave that for a few seconds. Right, sounds like all of you have now responded. Thank you very much. So Sasha, can we put the results up on the screen?
Hi Annie, are you able to see the results?
No.
Okay, so I'll just read them out. The policymakers and buyers of steel are at 35% each, finance is at 24%, and innovators are at 6%, and no one voted for NGOs and civil society.
So that's 35% industry.
Of the audience voted for policymakers and buyers of steel. 24% for finance.
So
and
interesting.
6% for innovators. Yeah.
Yeah. So policy and demand are the big one, and a large role there for finance. That's good to see. That's balanced. I'm going to show you, just to give you a quick outline of what the ResponsibleSteel theory of change is, in order to, from our perspective, how we believe we can drive change from our side. So we have our standard, we have our assurance program, and we have our multi-stakeholder community. Now, within that community, we have all of those stakeholders. So we certainly work with steel producers to get their sites certified, and all the time as they get certified, they understand the value better of that certification. But we have a big push with buyers to pledge and specify ResponsibleSteel, and members of ResponsibleSteel that are buyers of steel have to commit to doing that. We also work with finance institutions to look at how they can use the ResponsibleSteel certification to further their work on minimizing risk and maximizing value for their investments. And we work with civil society, who are we have a number of members as an important caucus of our membership. So we work with all of our members to advocate for ResponsibleSteel, to create the market value for ResponsibleSteel, and we also, and increasingly, I would say over the past year, work with policymakers and think tanks to think about how standards can harmonise across the world and across different initiatives, because there's an explosion of different initiatives that is going on. Now, by driving ResponsibleSteel certification and driving up those progress levels, we believe we can drive up standards within the industry and ultimately reduce emissions and forge a responsible path towards net zero steel. A few examples of how we do that. Interested that customers were higher up on your list than finance. That might reflect the audience, I'm sure. But soon after we were founded, we set about also working with a climate group to create a buyers alliance of companies that buy steel to commit to buying responsibly sourced steel. So members of Steel Zero are from the automotive industry, the construction industry, the white goods industry, the energy industry, the shipping industry, and they commit to certain commitments by 2030. But they're saying by 2030, half of the steel we buy will come from a responsible source, and that definition of what is responsible is linked to ResponsibleSteel's certification. Similarly, the First Movers Coalition has members that pledge to make 10% of their procurement by 2030 near zero steel. That's a bolder ambition, and that feeds into the 170 million tonnes that I mentioned earlier that needs to be in place by 2030 if we're going to be on the right trajectory for a 1.5 degree world. So those are two examples, and in the months to come, you will see the First Movers Coalition and Steel Zero working with buyers and ask steelmakers, if you can make near zero steel by 2030, put your cards on the table, let us know what you are planning to produce, and use the ResponsibleSteel methodology to ensure that the way you're measuring carbon is comparable across the board. The First Movers Coalition will then work to link the steelmakers with potential off-takers to enable the conditions for financing of the investments that's needed once they've got the off-take agreement. We're also working through a finance working group, so we have a unique conversation between steelmaker and investor. That includes both bankers and equity investors. We've got a broad program, and we're currently working on what is the business case for investing in decarbonised steel assets. What are the obstacles to getting there? There are still, I think, a lot of risks which are preventing that finance from really starting to flow. And there we are. We're talking with, as I mentioned, with think tanks and policy members on how consistent standards can actually create more effective policy. And of course, policymakers are usually at the national level, but in order to make global change, there are dynamics that mean a global perspective is actually the only one that will really drive global change. So it's really important that policymakers at the national level also think of themselves as global players. I won't go into detail on the policy side here. We are not the policy expert, but we work to ensure that a common measurement standard and a common definition underpins the policies that are there to incentivize, so that they're incentivizing something which is measurable and actually effective. We also have civil society members that are driving change. So I was interested that there was a 0% response on this one. Perhaps these aren't as high profile in some people's worlds as others, but there are NGOs also working to engage with particularly buyers of steel to decarbonize their supply chain. And this example is one from the automotive sector, where an NGO, Mighty Earth, is targeting particular automotive companies to really step up and commit to being responsible in their supply chain. And one of the ways they suggest that they do this is to join ResponsibleSteel and commit to specifying ResponsibleSteel certified steel in their procurement. Okay, so that's just a quick overview. I haven't gone into the technicalities of decarbonising steel. ResponsibleSteel is technologically neutral, but at the same time, I'm very happy to answer questions if you've got specific ideas on that. So I'll leave it there. Thanks, Simon. Back to you.
My goodness. Well, thank you very much, Annie. That's an awful lot to ponder on then. Now, I can see that we've got a huge number of questions from the audience. We'll try and get to them all, but as the chairman, the privilege of asking the first one falls to me. Now, Annie, as you said in your excellent presentation, iron and steel are one of the hardest industries to decarbonize because you've got high heat requirements, you actually use carbon as a process input, there's low profit margins, there's a fairly long asset life as well. So decarbonizing steel is expensive. What market measures can be put in place to actually protect manufacturers who are going down this path from being undercut by cheap, high carbon imports?
That's a really good question. If it wasn't such a traded commodity, that wouldn't be an issue, would it? You could invest in your, if you take electricity, the UK invested in offshore wind without fearing that it was going to get undercut by coal-based electricity. But that's not the case with steel. So the first thing that needs to happen is that the policy measures that are taken at home are consistent with global decarbonisation. So what's very tempting is for any country to say, we will push for the lowest carbon steel. We will push our steel makers to produce the lowest carbon steel. And so they should. However, that needs to be in the global context. If you are in a country with 20% scrap availability, the lowest carbon steel you're going to be able to create will reflect that 20% of scrap availability. So you're going to have a large chunk of primary steel. And a country like that might be Korea or India, for example. So there's a very real threat then that you could be undercut. You could create so on average, a ton of steel today is around 2 tons of carbon per ton. Okay, if you're using more scrap, then it'll be down to about half a ton of carbon, and if you're using less scrap, it could be up as much as 3 tons. Okay, so if you're in Korea or India and you've got a relatively low amount of scrap, your average emissions might be around 2 tons. Okay, so you as a policymaker then set you might set up an incentive scheme or a carbon tax scheme, carbon market to incentivize and drive decarbonisation of your domestic steel plants. And you might say we need by 2025 or 2030, you might say all of our steel plants need to get down to 1.5. Okay, but then you could easily be facing imports that are one of two things. They could either be higher emissions imports that somehow evade your own incentive system and are cheaper, or they could be lower emissions imports from countries that have very high amounts of scrap. And they could be undercutting. So they could be coming in at half a ton, for example. Now, if you're investing in an incentive scheme, you want to ensure that the funds that you're allocating are going to the best end result, end outcome, and that outcome has to be global decarbonisation of steel. So what you need is a domestic policy in conjunction with something at the border which is consistent with your domestic policy, but is also consistent with the global decarbonisation challenge. So it's actually very difficult.
Like EU's border carbon tax.
It could be something like the CBAM. It could be something like the CBAM, but what I would suggest is that one has to be very careful in the way one defines the embodied carbon of steel, because it differs in different parts of the world depending on how mature their economy is. And if you set it at too low a level, you're going to completely close out all the developing countries, and you will not be incentivizing them. If you set it to too high a level, obviously you're then going to be undercut, as you said, by dirtier steel. So we spent 3 years at ResponsibleSteel developing an embodied emissions standard which takes into account this scrap variability across the world. and we've come up with what we think is a very elegant and sophisticated way of doing that. And that I think is a really important element of policy making, always to have an eye on how do we drive global decarbonisation, not only in our country.
Excellent. Now, hopefully, I've got a question here from Clive, which hits on this point of the drive to steel recycling. What more can be done to incentivize steel recycling globally?
So today we have about 30% of global steel production coming from scrap. That scrap comes from stocks that were made on average 35 years ago as steel products. About 85% of scrap is recovered. So there is a small margin that is not recovered. And I've just been in India, where I saw, plenty of cars that have been on the road for 30 years or more. India have just brought in a policy to require an end of life for a vehicle after a certain period of time, and they're doing that for trucks as well as cars. So that's the kind of policy that certainly can bring the older, nearing obsolescent products back into the scrap supply chain. But generally, if you look at Europe or the US, most scrap is recycled. We can think of cars, we can think of washing machines. That's all recycled. Perhaps the cages on a champagne cork might not be. So we can remember to put those in the right bin when we pop our champagne. But generally speaking, that's not so much of the issue. There's a small amount globally that can be improved, and I think things like end of life for vehicles is a good kind of policy. But I think more generally we can think about the demand for steel. How can we reduce the demand for steel by making our use of steel more efficient? You've got steelmakers who for many years have been working on how to get more out of each ton of steel, so that you actually make steel stronger, for example, in automotive, so that you've got these very, very high strength steels. You need less of them. So that's one example. You've got steel reuse that we see in skips and sheet piles. What other steel products can be reused? And the construction industry has been working on this for many years. And if you talk to any engineer about how to structurally design a building, they can tell you that there's a very straightforward modular approach that if everybody used, we'd be cutting our steel use, structural steel use, by about 30%. But we don't, because we all want our buildings to be slightly different, and last minute decisions to put in another bit here and another bit there. So, but there are very intelligent ways in which we can reduce the amount of steel we use, and that kind of material efficiency is really important. Finally, I would say there's there's potentially more one can do in the way products are designed to ensure that they are reusable, remanufacturable. Car engines, for example, is something that the industry worked on for quite some time over the last 20 years. Not so much relevant today with the advent of EVs, but remanufacturable. We used to all be able to replace the door on our washing machine. We can't do that anymore. Standards
for repair and recycling, absolutely. Now, I have a technical question here from Hugh, which is, which certification bodies are actually involved in your certification, and do they have recognised accreditation from an IAF accreditation body?
Yes, so our certification bodies range. We've got about 35 certification bodies. They all have to meet international requirements for their assurance qualifications and their management systems and their governance systems. And then the individual auditors get accredited when they not only pass ResponsibleSteel's exams, but have qualifications in particular areas around health and safety or greenhouse gas emissions, for example. That's all against internationally recognised accreditation schemes, yes. So we've got the likes of DNV, Bureau Veritas, LRQS, and so on.
Excellent. Now this is an interesting one from Benjamin, who would like to know what your thoughts are on the biggest challenge there is for decarbonising steel in the developed world. Do you think it's a more technological issue, or is it a regulatory challenge? So this is for the developing world.
I can really only reflect what I hear from the steelmakers and the technology members that we have. I think that's the best way to approach this. Technologically, much of the technology is available. So hydrogen reduction of steelmaking, it's been demonstrated plenty of times. A lot of steelmakers have actually introduced it into the blast furnace instead of pulverized coal injection. They introduced natural gas for many years, and also then that enables you to then introduce hydrogen, and that reduces your emissions. So that technology is there. Using hydrogen with a new kind of furnace called the DRI, often the poster child of steel decarbonisation technologies. That's been proven. There's a steel plant in Europe that's been doing that. There's another one in Canada that's been doing that. And there are the few near zero steel plants I mentioned on the cards in the next few years will involve that kind of technology, hydrogen DRI. So that's the technology is not the issue. Scaling it up will be an issue. There'll be huge health and safety challenges. Put in the right infrastructure to ensure the safety of the processes. But that's that in itself, I don't think is the biggest challenge. There are other technologies coming through, carbon capture and utilization, which are being demonstrated in China and Europe. There was one launched in November last year in Belgium called Carbolist, based on a sort of a process of capturing carbon monoxide and turning it into ethanol. Carbon capture and sequestration is a challenge, and it's not a technological challenge. I think it's an infrastructure challenge, and therefore it's a policy challenge. We don't seem to have the right drivers in place to really make that happen at scale, and that's going to need to take some concerted efforts to pilot and demonstrate that, and then scale up. And then there's one other technology I would mention, which is direct electrolysis, where you're actually simplifying the process altogether and using electrical energy to reduce the iron ore. Bang, you're done. That was a technology which everyone thought would not be ready before 2035 at the earliest. An announcement was made by ArcelorMittal a few months ago to say in 2027 they're going to be running a demonstration plant. So 100,000 tons. So that is very, very promising, and that's the kind of thing that gives me hope that with the right policy and finance in place, the right drivers from the demand side, which also contributes to the business case, then we can accelerate these kind of technologies. But if there's one thing that stands in the way, I think it is the ability to scale up the renewable energy and the hydrogen at scale to enable this to happen in the right time frame. Now, I think that's a challenge for Europe. We haven't got the space that the US has, and we haven't got the sun that Australia has. So that is going to be a challenge. And when I listen to the energy companies, they say permitting is one of the biggest issues that slows them down. So if we're talking about speed, then it's those are the kind of issues.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Annie. Now, I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, that time has caught up with us. I know that some of you have still got questions to ask. Please send them to us and we'll pass them on to Annie. Please do contact our speaker to continue this discussion. You can email us and we can pass your details on. We're also going to be posting the recording of this presentation online in the next couple of days, so you can revisit what Annie's been talking about. It just remains for me to thank the members of the FS Club for making today possible. I would also urge you to keep an eye on our forthcoming events. We have got APP fraud, UK government and UK Supreme Court at odds on the 29th of August, the use of DLT in capital markets on the 31st of August, living with American power on the 4th of September, and financial centers of the world, a focus on Warsaw on the 6th of September. Now, you can catch up with all our previous webinars on YouTube, on our LinkedIn channel, or our Pizzazz TV channel. We do hope you'll join us again soon. Thank you very much and goodbye.
Bye-bye.